Luke Fowler's being in a place which was funded. So there's this cottage industry in Glasgow. Margaret Tait, who I believe probably lived in a cottage, I imagine. She also lived in Rome briefly. But Margaret Tait is an experimental filmmaker from Orkney, so really, really Scotland, above Scotland. And she's a well-loved, I would say kind of overrated, but experimental filmmaker who is a sort of a bit of an icon up there. When I lived in I've lived in Glasgow for a month a few years ago, and I think it was around the time of the centenary of Margaret Tait where a lot of these films were being funded, like this, that were sort of tributes or proposals for tributes to Tait. It does just feel a bit like when you go to a small town that has like one famous artist comes from it, and that's all anyone ever talks about. It's a
bit like Macintosh in the Glasgow as well.
Exactly, it's just tragic, really. It's because a lot of the most exciting people basically lived in cities. You don't see the cities.
John Berger lived in the Farsi. Some interesting people live in the countryside.
Of course, but
probably, maybe.
But yeah, but it's anyway. This is kind of discourse because basically it's not as well made as it could be. I say this as a fan of Luke Fowler's early work. I like his sort of 3-minute wonder shorts that he made for Channel 4 back in the day that were just kind of shots of his bedroom and his room and the streets on 16mm. I mean, he's obviously a 16mm file. He likes them.
Because he's very 16. Much involved in this. He's very much involved. That's a parody. Do not sue us. There's because he's kind of interested in archives and conservation of film and analog film stocks. I think that's his whole métier, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think his greatest work is All Our Divided Selves, which is a documentary about R.D. Laing, the sort of anti-psychiatrist. This film is sort of meant to be an attempt to execute a proposal for a film set in Orkney that she had proposed to make with Channel 4, and she'd been kind of led along a bit and then eventually sort of brusquely thrown off by the producers. This is the letters that are between her and the producer or the commissioning editor are posted on screen in a pretty pathetic attempt to make us feel kind of mournful and
that's a bit depressing
and sad, about. I mean, it's like, she, would it have been that good a film? Was this a particularly good film? I think Scotland really needs to get its the Scottish art scene really needs to get its head out of its own arse. It's kind of pathetic, just constantly trailing after this old biddy whose work is just not, it's nowhere near the level of Brett Brackage. Or even really Murray Menken.
There's work that's come out of the London Filmmakers Co-op and stuff that is perhaps more worthy of a kind of this auditory.
And maybe they need, because she's a woman or whatever, maybe they need that as an in to get funding to do experimental films. Can experimental films need to be done? Not all of them need to be done on 16mm, but sure, we can have that. I was disappointed because I think Luke Fowler has a feel for the materiality of film and deploys it in the modern era really well. I like seeing phones and magazines and the things I don't usually see on 16mm in his lens. You're right about that. There's a kind of excitement to seeing the modern shot on film or analog, and it kind of, we keep invoking Bresson at the moment, or I do, but it's about Bresson saying that the powerful work of art kind of detaches something from its context and puts it in a new light, and I think it does that. He's done it very well. I think actually he's kind of interested in these figures. I mean, his film about Cornelius Cardew, the English composer, or specifically about his scratch orchestra, is really good. But maybe the subject matter is more interesting, because Cornelius Cardew is a super influential avant-garde composer. I think also these films, I haven't seen the Cardew one, but the R.D. Laing one certainly. I saw the R.D. Laing film when I was very young. It was when it was the Turner Prize, and they showed it in full again, like sort of across the day. And I didn't know who R.D. Laing was at that point. And
and it was my introduction to Artie Lang. And some might expect that a better introduction to Artie Lang would be a conventional sort of BBC arena documentary or whatever. But no, actually, the best intro I could have had to Artie Lang's fascinating, corpus of work and project was this extraordinary experimental film by a great filmmaker, which sort of linked together archive and all this stuff. I'm into it, but I support the project. But in the case of the Margaret Tait film, he doesn't really allow anyone to learn anything new about Margaret Tait. It mainly seems to serve the kind of existing audience of people who somehow aren't sick of hearing about this overrated parochial
I think
artist.
we've kind of touched on a point here. There's there's a line here we said about British or UK filmmaking and biopics and treatments of lives of the artist. I think this is all part of the same thing. So it's in a way it's one of British filmmaking's greatest strengths and also one of its greatest weaknesses. And I think it's often towards the more literary and kind of highbrow that it kind of comes to grief. People sort of thinking about Grant G's Patience.
The Sebald film,
which is a really indulgent and kind of unhelpful unpicking of a book that has been so dragged, so
just nostalgism, I guess, fetish.
Yeah, but I think it's just certain books. Like I think people are so relieved that a book like The Rings of Saturn was written, but it's written by a bloody German man. It's written from a German post-war existential perspective. It's got really nothing to do with the English landscape whatsoever. So I feel like this kind of attachment, this kind of attachment mode to certain works of art and artists in the UK is pretty obnoxious. Sometimes.
There is a funny bit at the end of this Margaret Tait film where there's a recording of an interview with her where she says that there are no good British films.
Amazing.
She's sort of listing all her favourite filmmakers and stuff, and then she says that the British ones are all she says the British don't have an eye for poetry.
I agree with that. Yeah.
But I don't really think Margaret Tait does either.
No. Physician heal thyself.
Yeah. So I'll take that. I'll take that statement. When Godard piles off British cinema, I hold my hands up and say, okay, you're allowed that because you have made some of the greatest films of all time, but from Scottish soil, I give it short shrift because there are filmmakers that, as we mentioned earlier with regards to biopics, there are British filmmakers who do have a sense of poetry, but they approach it in a unique way. And if you're not prepared to sort of articulate what that route is, everyone can access that poetry. Every nation, every person.
Okay, Jeremy Corbyn. There's a poem in everyone.
No, I mean there isn't a poem in everyone.
No, definitely not.
Material circumstances do consign us, unfortunately.
Cut me open, and you will see no poems.
You've published many, but I do. I think it's just a facile statement that got a ripple from the audience, but it just
who is that serving?
It just underlined what a kind of like pathetic piece of nostalgism this film was.